Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. You think House of Cards is a TV show? Sort of. Also kind of real, though, it turns out. Today, the FBI brought charges against the former director of security for the Senate Intelligence Committee. It was part of an ongoing investigation of secret information that has been leaked to the press over the years. The man in question is called James Wolfe. He was in charge of handling information as it passed from the executive branch to the Congress. Wolfe had access to huge amounts of highly classified information, including intelligence documents. Now, a job like that requires unimpeachable integrity. Wolfe is accused of leaking classified material to several reporters and then lying about it to the FBI. And it gets weirder from there. Allegedly, Wolfe passed information to a college student called Allie Watkins. Watkins later went on to become a reporter at several media outlets, including Politico, BuzzFeed, and the New York Times. Wolfe, who is in his 50s, has admitted having a relationship apparently with Watkins that went on for 3 years. Watkins has denied that Wolfe was ever a source for her stories, but text messages released today strongly suggest otherwise. Here's one, quote, "I always tried to give you as much information so you could get that scoop before anyone else," Wolfe wrote to Watkins. "I felt like I was part of your excitement and was always very supportive of your career and the tenacity you exhibited to chase down a good story." It goes on like this. It's pretty sad and a little creepy. "I felt like I was part of your excitement." You know, you imagine these guys are sinister. It turns out they're mostly just pathetic. Though they are kind of sinister too, actually. The Russia hoax would not exist. It wouldn't have metastasized to take over our entire government, our entire national conversation, if corrupt bureaucrats like this weren't misusing their power, which they are. So it's hard to feel too much sympathy for this Wolfe guy. On the other hand, the feds once again are prosecuting somebody whose sole alleged crime is lying to the feds. It would be nice if our government went after people for real crimes once in a while. Might make you feel a little better about the system. The DOJ also seized phone and email records from a reporter in this case and apparently broke into encrypted text exchanges. Didn't know that was possible. Turns out it is. This all looks a lot like what the Obama people used to do. It was worrisome then, and it's worrisome now. When the government spies on American citizens, it is always a big deal, whether those citizens are New York Times reporters or whether they are Trump campaign staffers. It doesn't matter. There had better be a very good reason for spying on Americans. The media, of course, do not recognize this. They only care when it's someone who shares their politics. As far as they're concerned, conservatives deserve to be wiretapped just because they're conservative. The press are partisan buffoons who wouldn't know a principle if it got in the shower with them, but the point remains. Dan Bongino is a former NYPD officer and Secret Service agent, and he joins us tonight. Dan, if you would, since I know you follow this story more carefully than anyone I know, put this in context for us. How does this Wolfe character fit into the larger story?
Well, Tucker, the name of Carter Page he was relatively anonymous in this scheme. Carter Page had assisted the FBI in a prior case where they locked up a Russian spy in the Buryakov case. But the name was relatively unknown at that point. Wolfe's the one who leaks the existence of the name Carter Page. The name was there. Leaks the name to Allie Watkins, who then writes this story. The story is then, this is where it gets ugly, Tucker, and this is why the press has zero credibility in this at all. That story by Watkins is then cited repeatedly to advance the Pravda-like media propaganda story that Trump's cooperating with the Russians because Carter Page, now that they have the name, was a Trump foreign policy advisor. This was used over and over again. This is this circle of lies and deceit we see. And I agree with you. Your opening statement's spot on. I have a libertarian spine, and I don't care who's in office. I am always concerned about the freedom of the press. Period, full stop. But what I find absolutely hypocritical is media Pravda-like phonies complaining now about government overreach while you've been dead silent on spying, on the prosecution of Mike Flynn, on all of this stuff. Give me a break. You forfeited your voice to talk a long time ago.
Spying, but it wasn't spying. Remember that? When a paid government informant gathered information secretly on 3 separate Trump campaign officials and sent it back to the government without telling the Trump campaign. That wasn't spying. That was just the FBI doing its duty, right?
You know, it's amazing. I watched your interview, which is a classic, by the way, with police stater Eric Swalwell, the congressman from California, who, when he mentioned spying, you know, he actually said something that was true to you, Tucker. And to be fair, he's not here to defend himself, but he said, hey, we only spy on the bad guys. He was right. Trump was the enemy. This is the new liberal police state mindset. Trump is the enemy, not the Chinese, not the trade relationships with the Chinese, not the Russians. The real enemy was Donald Trump. He was absolutely right. This is the new liberal mindset. Trump is the bad guy, and you're right. As long as you're spying on conservatives, it's A-OK, and we'll play the euphemisms game. No, he was an informant. That's nonsense. He was a spy, and everybody knows it.
We used to have trials that helped us understand who was the bad guy or not. I mean, people were accused of things, and then it went before a jury or a judge, and we knew for certain. But now, the accusation is itself considered proof of guilt. When did that happen?
Yes, I'm glad you brought this up because, Tucker, remember, this is what frequently gets lost in this. Wolf's related to this Carter Page story. Remember, Carter Page is the entry point for the signals intelligence spying operation, the interception of the emails and texts into the Trump team. Tucker, nobody to this day has provided a scintilla of evidence that there was probable cause of the two things they needed to spy on Carter Page. That he was acting as a foreign agent or on behalf of a foreign agent, and secondly, in violation of U.S. law. Nobody has shown that. Carter Page is out doing cable interviews, probably tonight somewhere. This is nonsense.
If Carter Page was guilty, why hasn't Carter Page been charged? I mean, as you just pointed out, his behavior was the pretext for this entire story. So doesn't it tell you something that he's not even been credibly accused of a crime?
The FBI and the Department of Justice, Tucker, walked into a foreign intelligence surveillance court, used to effectively the Star Chamber, right? Used to prosecute the worst among us, terrorists, the worst savages on the planet. They bring Carter Page in there to spy on him, and you're right. He's out walking around right now. Matter of fact, the FBI is not interviewing him. I know of no controls on his behavior at all.
No, it's true.
The answer is because there probably is no indications of criminal behavior at all, and they desperately want that angle of it to go away.
And once you talk to Carter Page, as you may have, you realize how sad this whole thing is. I mean, Carter Page was never a Russian agent or an agent of anybody. I'm not even sure what he does for a living. I mean, it's pathetic. Dan, thank you. It's great to see you.
Yes, sir.
Ethan Behrman is a California radio show host. He joins us for the first time here in Washington, and we're glad to see him. Ethan, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Tucker. Great to be here.
So are you bothered by, and I said it right in the open, I'm bothered whenever Americans are spied upon by their government. Sometimes it has to be done. But there ought to be a really good reason. The press is saying that today. Why haven't they been saying that about the spying on the members of the Trump campaign?
Well, because there was a suspicion in the first place that the Russians were trying to infiltrate the Trump campaign. So there is a difference. I share that concern that you have. I'm always worried when the government is intruding on our individual freedoms. Remember, the right to privacy is actually still relatively new. 1967 is when the Supreme Court ruled on that. It's not in the Constitution, a right to privacy. But here we have the Russians trying to interfere in our campaign. We know that. It's clear. We have 20 people who have been charged with crimes in the Mueller investigation so far. Carter Page maybe hasn't actually been charged yet, but the investigation is not over yet.
But does it bother you that, I mean, this is not an opinion. I think this is a fact from the information we have at hand, that Carter Page was the first link in this now very long chain of the Russia hoax. Well, and so Carter Page's purported collaboration with the Putin government against the U.S. government, that started everything. So why is Carter Page, does it bother you that he's still walking around and doing cable shows, including this one?
Yes. I mean, yes, on one hand, if they had the evidence. But as we know from investigations, sometimes an investigation starts and you're down one thread. Other threads come out of that. Maybe the Carter Page thread went to a dead end.
Well, but the Carter Page thread is what allowed the spy, and you're right, of course, but the Carter Page thread allowed the spying by the Obama administration on a rival political campaign. It's got to be a pretty high bar for doing that. Maybe there are cases where you have to do it, but you never want to do that because it would shake Americans' faith in their government. But Carter Page's behavior was the pretext for that, and he's still free. So as a civil libertarian, you've got to think, wow, maybe they made a really big mistake in basing the spying on Carter Page because they haven't charged him.
Well, but then simultaneously we had the Papadopoulos situation, right?
But they haven't charged him either for any crime against the United States. They charged him for lying.
And that's the easy way out. You brought that up in the intro, right?
I'm bothered by it.
Where prosecutors take the easy way out sometimes, where it's easier to prove that.
I'm not partisan on this question. Yeah. I mean, it would be very easy for me to say, this guy Wolf should go to prison for lying, and maybe he should.
Right.
But I'm really bothered as an American by the fact that all these people, going back, as I always say, back to Martha Stewart, are charged not with the crime that undergirded the investigation, but on the basis of some conversation they had with federal agents. I mean, that's not fair play, actually, in the end.
Because the federal agents often know the answer before they enter the room.
As liberals used to point out. So Papadopoulos has not been even credibly accused of betraying his country. So, like, where's the crime? Where's the real crime? That's a fair question.
Ultimately, the crime here is we have Russia attacking the United States.
But that's not a crime that the people who are spied upon committed.
Potentially, while Manafort was his associate.
He hasn't been charged with that either.
Just additional charges again today because he immediately was using an encrypted messaging system. We have to assume it's something like a WhatsApp type thing that he was using to immediately try and get people to lie to the investigators.
This is a real big issue. I'm not defending obstruction of justice at all. But that is a crime subsequent to the original charge.
Right.
So what you still lack in this whole thing, and it should really start to bother all of us, just on principle, is any evidence that the underlying charge was true. Nobody has been charged for collaborating with Russia, for hacking our democracy. All of that stuff just turns out to be crap, actually.
Well, no, there's a difference between provable in a court of law versus the suspicion that something is going on. And I think that's the case with Carter Page at this point. There was a real suspicion going on because of his time in Moscow, his bragging about it, his participation in 2013 or his investigation in 2013. I think there was a lot there, and maybe it just hasn't fully
I know, but this
out.
is a law enforcement. I mean, this is not a cable news debate. This is a law enforcement investigation, and the end result ought to be an indictment. If there was a crime, indict the person for it. Prove it. You can't besmirch someone's reputation, make it impossible for him to work again, as they've done to Carter Page, without proving that he committed a crime. And they haven't. They're not even trying. Like, how dare they do that to an American citizen? Do you feel that way?
Well, I think that we need to wait for the Mueller investigation to conclude so we can see all of the information that happened here. Plus, some of it was a FISA court. You know, FISA courts are relatively secret. We can have the civil libertarian debate over how secret should FISA courts really be. But we don't know exactly what happened in the FISA courts because it's secret.
Do you think that Carter Page, from what you know, and we know a lot because it's been leaked by people like this Wolf character, do you think he did anything that should land him in jail, that should destroy his life? This has destroyed his life. Do you think that's fair?
I think if anybody is doing something to undermine the integrity of a United States election by trying to sell out to a foreign power who wants to interfere in our election, whether the foreign power succeeded or not, absolutely should be held to
I couldn't
account.
agree more. I see it happen here in Washington every day as we capped out all kinds of different countries, Russia not among them.
Yeah.
So I agree with that. But I'm talking specifically about Carter Page, whose life has been destroyed. Do you think he deserves to go through what he's going through now?
If he was participating in attempting to commit that kind of a crime.
But if he wasn't, and they can't prove he was, then don't you think we all owe him a big apology? Like, hey, Carter Page, sorry we wrecked your life.
If it turns out
maybe you and Monica Lewinsky can go out to dinner and talk about what it feels like.
Or the no longer with us Richard Jewell actually is maybe
I totally agree. I couldn't agree more.
Right, if that is the case. But as of now, we just don't have enough information.
Well, I hope someone is honorable enough to apologize to the people who we've destroyed and then discarded. And he would be on that list, along with Richard Jewell and Monica Lewinsky and Gary Condit and a bunch of other people whose lives were destroyed by a reckless and stupid media establishment.
But I don't think that this is entirely reckless. I think what we have going on here is some real things.
But he better turn out to be Putin's best friend, or else I'm going to feel bad about this. Ethan, thank you. Great to see you in D.C.
Tucker, thank you.
The mayor of Philadelphia danced for joy after a federal court said it was fine for him to ignore the nation's immigration laws and allow alien criminals to live in his city. So they solved all the other problems in Philadelphia, and to make it even better, they're going to bring in some illegal alien criminals. We'll unpack that next. Well, federal court set up a roadblock to common sense yesterday, ruling that the administration could not cut off certain federal funds to the city of Philadelphia in response to its sanctuary city policies, the ones that protect criminal aliens. In response to this news, the mayor of Philadelphia, James Kenney, broke into a celebratory dance, which we're going to torture you with right now. Watch.
A sanctuary city, yeah. A sanctuary city, yeah.
Well, Democrats dancing at the idea of foreign citizens committing crimes in their cities. Jumaane Williams is a New York City Council member, is running for lieutenant governor of New York State, and he joins us now. Mr. Williams, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
So, I don't know if you've been to Philadelphia recently, and I don't want to beat up on the city. There's a lot good about Philadelphia, but Philadelphia has a lot of problems. I mean, industry died, massive homelessness, huge crime problem, a lot of poverty in the city. And here you have the mayor more excited Not about fixing the schools or keeping his own citizens safe, but about allowing criminals from other countries, foreign citizens, to live in his city. It seems like a weird priority to me. What do you think?
Well, just to correct something, the presence of undocumented residents is not a criminal act. It's actually civil violation. And so maybe he's excited that they won't be spending resources.
Well, no, actually, no, they're not spending any resources on it. And there are a lot of ways to look at this, but I'm speaking specifically of the Philadelphia policy that, in effect, protects criminal aliens. Aliens are all breaking the law by their presence if they're here illegally. But I mean people who commit felonies are being protected by the city of Philadelphia. Why is that in the interest of Philadelphia residents?
I know that human beings, I know you call them aliens, I'd like to rehumanize them. Human beings, whether they're citizens or non-citizens, commit crimes. The question is, why are we spending resources on one group of people? And the reason we're doing that is based primarily on fear and bigotry that's ginned up sometimes. Sometimes like folks like you, sometimes
it's
like
funny.
the president.
It's funny. Have you looked at the polling among African Americans on illegal immigration, the people you say you represent? Have you looked at the effect on their wages by the presence of millions, 20 million illegal aliens in this country? It pushes those wages down. Who are you representing exactly?
Well, actually, if you look at the data, sanctuary cities are safer actually than non-sanctuary cities.
It's just silly.
And they actually have better economics than non-sanctuary cities. The question is...
That's totally false. I mean, by the way, I do this for a living. I'm very familiar with the data, as you put it, and that's just simply not true. But let me ask you this question, though. At some point, does it matter to a politician whose job it is, whose sworn duty it is to represent the citizens of his district or state, whether or not someone's a citizen? These are foreign nationals. They're citizens of another country. Does that matter?
Well, in New York City, I have a lot of tourists in the city. I believe my job is to represent all the people who are in my city and in my state at any given time. And I know you're a public safety person, so my question is, why would we not view this from a public safety point of view? And as I mentioned, sanctuary cities are safer.
There's a huge... Sanctuary cities are not safer. That's one of many statistics that are fake that the left throws around, like, you know, millions of people don't have government ID, another lie from a made-up study. But let me ask you this.
That's actually a great point. We should give them driver's license. That's another thing.
No, I'm aware.
For public
you'll make it much better. Is there a difference between a U.S. citizen and a citizen of a foreign country?
Yes, you just said it. But both of them are human beings. And the question is, if we took all the law enforcement agents and said, you know what, we want you to focus on the streets that have 2 cars on it and that have parked wrong, those are civil violations. Why would we do that? There's no reason to do that. These are civil violations. The reason that we focus on undocumented immigrants that are probably from S-hole countries and not Norway is based in bigotry and fear. There is no public safety.
Do you think, so there's a new Pew poll out that showed that far more African Americans think immigration has made their lives worse than made their lives better. Are they racist for saying that?
So the lieutenant governor of this state agrees more with you on these issues. He doesn't believe in giving driver's license.
But I'm not actually asking about the lieutenant governor's state. I just wanted your view of that.
I was also saying,
are those people racist for having that view?
And the current governor, they do policy by polls. I don't. I do policy by what's right.
No, actually, what you were doing is what many in the left do, which is go to motive. And you were saying that these concerns grow out of bigotry. You were impugning my motives. And so let me ask you about the motives as revealed in this new Pew poll. What do you think of that?
You shouldn't talk about motives when we're talking about policy? Is that what you're saying?
You're the one who brought it up. You said people support this because they're bigots. And my question was, a brand new poll just came out. It showed that far more African Americans, and of every ethnic group, I'm just picking one, are against immigration than are for it. Does that mean they're bigots too?
I don't think they're against immigration. What
it's made their lives worse.
No, it has not. And most atrocities,
they think it has.
Most atrocities in this world has been based on people who use some sort of law to separate people out and say they're the other and commit atrocities. So
you guys are so high on this ideology, you can't see straight.
But let me give you, when you call them animals, when you call them from S-hole countries, that is dehumanization. When you separate
so Haiti, I mean, whatever. Even to resurrect these arguments are so dumb I can barely stand it. Let me just bring you into the present. This is the Daily News cover for tomorrow.
Sure.
Obviously the biggest tabloid in New York. Disgrace to our country. It's a defense of a criminal alien who's been on the lam for 8 years. But at the bottom, it says, and I don't know if you can read it, I think it says how city and state can unite against ICE.
Yes.
Do you think it's the place of Democrats to encourage open attacks on a federal law enforcement agencies? That
like
position
I said,
that you hold.
Some Democrats have been part of the problem. The person I run against, Lieutenant Governor, why I'm running for Lieutenant Governor, agrees with you on some of these issues. And so Democrats have been part of the problem in stoking some of the fear. What I'm saying to you is we have to view these people as human beings and figure out why we're so focused on this one group of people when there is no public safety benefit.
Because their presence lowers wages for poor people. Supply and demand is a real thing.
Pablo,
this has been shown again and again.
Pablo, who was delivering a pizza in that article you were spoken about, first of all, had he had a driver's license, he would still be here.
Okay, this is insane, actually. And if you guys ever... If you ever
time
take
and time
power,
again, the only reason you were
in
deported
trouble.
is because you've had success in ginning up fear that is
because
irrational.
we're racist.
No, I didn't say that. I said
that's exactly what you're saying.
It's based in irrational
and you're
fear.
too cowardly to say it out loud. You're calling me a racist.
My parents are immigrants. I'm a son of immigrants, as a matter of fact.
Jumaane Williams, running for Lieutenant Governor of New York. God help that state. President Trump.
God bless it.
God bless that state. I agree with that too. President Trump shaking up the G7 ahead of this weekend summit. What are the diplomatic implications of this? Why is everyone pushing him to hate Russia? Should we hate Russia? What do we get out of hating Russia? That's all next. President Trump making news ahead of Saturday's G7 summit in France. He's battled with Canada's Justin Trudeau and the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, over trade restrictions. He's announced plans to leave the summit early to get to Singapore for his meeting with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Now the president says the G7 ought to reinstate Russia into the group after a 4-year hiatus, arguing that it's better to have Russia at the negotiating table rather than away from it. This is, of course, causing all the howling you would expect from the usual Washington people. David Tafuri advised Barack Obama's campaign on foreign policy, and he joins us tonight. David, this sounds like something liberals used to say during the Cold War. It's better to be at the table talking than not to be. Why is that not true now?
That's absolutely still true, but this was a strange platform for Trump to make this comment at the G7 summit. As you noted, he's gotten in arguments and squabbles with two of our closest allies, Canada and France, but then his one statement of support is for Russia, who is not there. Also of interest, he didn't say why he wants Russia to be there. Is there some trade deal he wants to do with the other G7 countries and Russia, or a security deal?
I haven't spoken to him about this, but here's a guess. We're very close to an actual war with Russia. We're fighting a war with Russia, as you know, in Syria. We've killed hundreds of Russians in Syria. And you could very easily see a war breaking out there. You could see a war breaking out over Ukraine. You could see problems in Georgia. I mean, we're as close to conflict with Russia as we've been in a long time. Why wouldn't you want to diffuse that a little bit? Is there an advantage to going to war with Russia?
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out, and I agree with you about that. But then you have to remember, why was Russia kicked out of the G8 in the first place in 2014? Because it annexed Crimea and violated Ukraine's sovereignty. Right. It's continuing in that effort by supporting a bloody war in eastern Ukraine. So that was a punishment to Russia. What Trump is suggesting is now taking away that punishment. And he doesn't even acknowledge that Russia is continuing the actions that we were intending to discourage by kicking them out of the G8 in the first place.
But I mean, if the point is to make a moral statement about how Putin is bad, worse than Stalin, liberals defended Stalin for 40 years, and now, Putin's worse than him somehow, we've made the statement. I mean, why wouldn't you want to do everything you could to diffuse armed conflict with a nuclear-armed Russia? But liberals want conflict with the nuclear-armed Russia. Why?
Well, there has to be a carrot and a stick approach. So part of the stick approach, so punishing Russia, was kicking them out of the G8. It's also putting sanctions in place on Russia. Now remember, we do have sanctions on Russia, but Trump got dragged kicking and screaming into doing the sanctions. He didn't want to do it. Republicans in Congress wanted to do it. Democrats in Congress wanted to do it. People in his own administration pushed for it.
I don't know why. I mean, because I think it's idiotic, actually. But to just really quickly explain, why is Russia a greater and more imminent threat to us than Mexico? Are they killing tens of thousands of Americans with fentanyl? Have they flooded our country with 20 million illegal aliens?
Well, Russia...
No, seriously, why are they a bigger threat to us than Russia?
They are a bigger threat to us because they're trying to interfere in our democracy. Going back to the January 2017
Really? Because
report
Mexico
from our
is
intel
encouraging
agencies.
people to invade our country, and a lot of them are trying to vote. And now people are saying that they need to be naturalized and allowed to vote. Speaking of affecting our democracy, nothing affects democracy more than demographic change. So Russia's still a bigger threat than Mexico, because why?
These are different types of threats. There are people that come from Mexico, and some of the illegal immigration is a threat to the U.S., and the drug cartels in Mexico are a threat. But the Mexican government is not a threat. The Mexican government's policies are not a threat. Whereas Putin, who is an authoritarian dictator, who's doing everything he can to stop the American influence around the world, to stop America's support for democracies around the world, and to protect our own democracy. He's a threat to all of those things, which it used to be all Americans agreed that was important.
Yeah,
on both sides of the aisle.
Americans have lost faith in the idea it's our job to spread democracy because our repeated attempts to do so didn't work and resulted in the rise of ISIS. So people are kind of rethinking that. Let me ask you this, though. Since Russia is the most evil place ever and Putin obviously is Lord Satan himself, what do you make of the fact that Alex Ovechkin, a hero here in Washington, won the Stanley Cup for the Caps last night in Vegas? You were at the game. Is a friend of Putin's and a promoter of Putin's in the United States. Should we put him in jail? I mean, I know he won the Stanley Cup, but he's friends with Putin. Should we incarcerate him?
Of course we should not incarcerate him. As you mentioned, I was lucky enough to be at the game in Vegas. It was amazing. That's an incredibly tough place for an opponent to play in the Vegas Stadium, and the Capitals did it.
Maybe the Russians hacked the game. Has it occurred to you?
No, Ovechkin is a big part of it. Ovechkin is the team leader. He scored a goal in the second period that was magnificent, so he deserves credit for that. Now, he has a friendship with Putin going back 10 years.
But doesn't that mean he should be in jail?
Of course,
he's like the Carter Page of hockey.
It doesn't mean he should be in jail. He's not interfering in our election, thank God. He's winning Stanley Cup.
For the record, I love
Ovechkin.
I could care less if he's friends with Putin.
Well, the point is, it's okay for him to be friends with Putin, but he shouldn't be supporting Putin's policies because he's here in America. We love him for his contributions to America, not for his support for
David
Putin.
Teferi, a hardened Caps fan. That's a compliment. Great to see you.
Thank you.
The campaign against global warming seems to have gone bust. It started as an effort to protect the environment. It is not that anymore. UC Berkeley visiting scholar Stephen Hayward just wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal detailing how the movement has been hijacked by obsessions with race and gender. Worries about carbon and rising sea levels have turned into speeches about fighting misogyny and so-called climate justice, whatever that is. Stephen Hayward joins us tonight to explain. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Tucker. Isn't it amazing how everything seems to get reduced to race and justice these days?
Well, yeah, but it's especially amazing when topics that have no conceivable connection to race and gender get pulled in. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, the whole point of the article was fairly simple. Most issues go through these long wave cycles. There's lots of early interest. The press gets onto it. Flurry of political activity. Some policies are made. Then we start having consideration of trade-offs. And that's been going on with global warming for several years now. It's really expensive to do what a lot of the climatistas, as I call them, want us to do. And so now that you're seeing more and more expressions, including in the Paris Climate Accord, that we need to consider gender equality and climate justice, that's a sign that the issue has, as the cliche goes, jumped the shark. And no, it's kind of at the end of its string. And public opinion surveys here and in Europe show declining public interest in the whole darn thing.
Well, it's a boutique issue for rich people, obviously, but it's also a little confusing. I mean, even if you think that climate justice is real, or even if you can explain what it is, I've never met anyone who can, or if you think that gender equality is an important part of this, what does that have to do with science? That's not science, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, and that was one of the things I said in the article is look, I'm not questioning any of what is called the consensus about climate science. Right. I'm just saying as a political and policy matter, this has run its course. And my goodness, you ought to see my Twitter feed blow up yesterday and today. Apparently, it's not enough to call someone a climate denier anymore when you dissent from climate orthodoxy. I'm getting called a white male supremacist, which is a really a good sign that you've run out of arguments about the issue itself.
Well, yeah, I mean, that doesn't even approach being an argument. It's a primal scream. Wait, you're at Berkeley. How were you allowed to say this at Berkeley? What are you doing there? And good for you for being there, by the way.
Well, yeah, I'm like that Civil War era general who said I'd like to fight surrounded. I think that might have been General Custer, though. I'm not sure. Look, two things two things that you and your audience should know and maybe be encouraged by a little bit. One is that we ought to make a distinction in all our universities these days between old-fashioned liberals who've dominated universities for decades. That's not a new story.
Right.
But increasingly, the universities are being dominated by a much more radical progressive left that, as we know, often turn to violence to get their way. And a lot of the old-fashioned liberals understand that this is a crisis for the universities. And a lot of them are starting to say, and this here I think you want to give props to the administration and many academics at Berkeley who said, we have a problem and we need to have some more conservative voices on our faculty and on our campus. And so they reached out to me a couple years ago and invited me to come, and I'm glad to be there. I'm having a great time. And I get along with most of the liberals on the campus just fine, and the radicals won't engage me at all.
Well, I think that's important to make the distinction. I mean, if liberalism is a concern for civil liberties, a commitment to free speech, a belief in actual diversity, then I'm a liberal and proud to be one. But there aren't many left. I'm glad you found some in Berkeley. That's really heartening. Professor, thank you. It was a great piece.
Well, thank you, Tucker.
Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade both died this week, both by suicide. They're not the only ones, unfortunately. Suicide is surging in this country. Why is that, and what can be done about it? Actual answers next. CNN host Anthony Bourdain died today in France, apparently by killing himself. His death comes 3 days after that of fashion designer Kate Spade, who also committed suicide. Their deaths are high-profile illustrations of a trend that is shocking and undercovered. According to CDC data released this week, the suicide rate in America rose more than 25% from 1999 to 2016. 45,000 people are killing themselves every year, about twice the number that are murdered. Antidepressants, interestingly, are more widely prescribed than ever, and yet they don't seem to be helping. Johann Hari is the author of one of the most important books in recent memory. It's called Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. He himself has suffered from depression for years. That's what drove him to write this amazing book. Johann joins us tonight. Johann, thank you for coming on. So,
hey Tucker, it's good to be with you, albeit on a dark day.
It is a dark day, but that number, I mean, I guess the point is that what we're doing isn't working, and no one is saying that. So the percentage of the population taking drugs meant to fight depression is rising, and yet so is the suicide rate. Isn't that like proof enough that what we're doing isn't working?
I wanted to understand that myself because I'd had periods of my life, as you know, where I have been acutely suicidal. So I ended up going on a big journey all over the world, talking to the leading experts about what causes these problems and what solves them. And I think one of the most interesting things, one of the reasons why this shocking news about this increase in suicide, one of the things that helps us to understand that is everyone watching your show knows they've got natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. There's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose.
Yes.
You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. Our culture is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. And it's not the only thing that's going on, but it's the reason why this crisis is growing and growing. So what we've got to do, if we want to find our way out of this, is understand the real causes of depression and anxiety. I learned there's scientific evidence for 9 of them, and solve those problems. Not just drug people, although drugs give some people some relief and they have some value. That's not the solution.
I'm not taking the Scientologist position here, by the way. I think there are clearly people who benefit from those drugs. But the idea that every case of clinical depression is a problem of brain chemistry is stupid. And yet that's what we're told. So what you're arguing...
I don't think it's just stupid. Yeah,
it's not just stupid. What?
It's not just stupid. It's misunderstanding the crisis. This depression, this anxiety, this addiction epidemic, these rising suicide rates, these are signals. They are telling us something. They're telling us something really important about what's going wrong in our culture and what we need to fix. And not just because for every person who's becoming suicidal or becoming depressed, most people's lives are diminished to some degree by these factors that are making us feel bad, like acute loneliness, like if you go to work tomorrow and you are controlled, so you have low or no choices over your work, you're much more likely to become depressed. If you had a traumatic childhood and you've not had a chance to release the shame about that, you are 3,100% more likely to attempt suicide. There's a whole range of causes of depression and anxiety that make sense. But when we tell people it's just a problem in their brain, of course, there are real factors in the brain, but when we tell them it's just a factor in the brain, what we're saying to them is, your pain doesn't mean anything. It's like a glitch in a computer program. And the most important thing we need to be explaining to anyone watching your show who is suicidal, who is depressed, who is anxious, is your pain makes sense. You're not crazy. You're not a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And
maybe
the
society is crazy. I mean, you were a brave man. We are out of time.
The Indian philosopher Krishnamurti said it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society.
Well, that's exactly right. This is a brave book, a counterintuitive book. You're going against the established view of it, and I appreciate that. Johan Hari, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tucker. The book's called Lost Connections.
NASA just announced that one of its rovers has discovered the building blocks of life on Mars. More than ever, looks like something could conceivably be out there. And there's more evidence on tape that indeed there is. The latest in UFO news next. NASA just announced it has discovered organic materials, the building blocks of life, all the way on Mars. But that's not the only fascinating space-related news to come out recently. According to a newly leaked Pentagon report, in 2004, a U.S. aircraft carrier was stalked for several days by a UFO that witnesses said resembled a supersonic tic-tac. The object reportedly could hover in midair and make itself invisible. This shocked to confuse the Navy pilots who monitored it. Nick Pope is a journalist and investigated UFO sightings for the British government. He joins us tonight. Nick, why would information like this, I know you've seen this a million times, but why would we need to read about it because it was leaked? Why wouldn't the U.S. government tell us this? Is there some reason?
Well, I think there's always embarrassment about anything in our airspace that performance characteristics exceed anything in our own inventory. And that, by the way, was the conclusion in this Pentagon document. This thing ran rings around our F-18 Super Hornets that tried to chase this thing. It was briefly tracked on radar, but then it seemed to be able to, and this again is a phrase from the document, it's almost like it cloaked itself and became invisible. You'd think this was science fiction if you weren't reading it in Pentagon documents. And we know now, which we didn't know before, that the government took this very seriously, and these things are being seen in our skies, whatever they might be, by pilots tracked on radar, and there's a serious defense and national security issue here.
And just to be clear, we don't believe that any other country possesses the technology to create an aircraft like this, right?
Absolutely correct, yes. One of the things that went into this report was obviously looking to see if this sort of thing was anything in our own inventory and indeed anything that any other nation has. I mean, certainly when I was investigating UFOs for the British government, we knew that some of these things would turn out to be secret prototype aircraft, drones and missiles, but we always knew through our own intelligence sources, you know, who has what, so you can eliminate that.
So what you're really saying is that the U.S. government and the British government have essentially concluded that there's something not from this world that humans did not create that is being tracked on radar and watched by people who watch aircraft for a living. I mean, this is real.
It is real. Now, the government doesn't go so far as to say these things are extraterrestrial, but certainly when I was doing this for the Ministry of Defense, our policy statement said neither do we rule out that possibility. We said that we kept an open mind on this. But of course, you know, these things, when their speeds and maneuvers are in excess of anything that you've got or anything that you're aware other nations have, you are forced almost to think the unthinkable. And absolutely. Part of the problem with this, of course, was just that senior political figures and military chiefs often just said UFOs and they rolled their eyes and it was the ridicule factor.
This seems like
we were able to say...
I'm sorry, we're out of time, Nick. This just seems like a story that we should be covering much more than we do, and I hope you will come back. Thank you.
Thank you, I will do.
We're going to close tonight with a tribute to a longtime friend of ours, Charles Krauthammer. That's next. just announced it has discovered organic materials, the building blocks of life, all the way on Mars. But that's not the only fascinating space-related news to come out recently. According to a newly leaked Pentagon report, in 2004, a U.S. aircraft carrier was stalked for several days by a UFO that witnesses said resembled a supersonic tic-tac. The object reportedly could hover in midair and make itself invisible. This shocked to confuse the Navy pilots who monitored it. Nick Pope is a journalist and investigated UFO sightings for the British government. He joins us tonight. Nick, why would information like this, I know you've seen this a million times, but why would we need to read about it because it was leaked? Why wouldn't the U.S. government tell us this? Is there some reason?
Well, I think there's always embarrassment about anything in our airspace that performance characteristics exceed anything in our own inventory. And that, by the way, was the conclusion in this Pentagon document. This thing ran rings around our F-18 Super Hornets that tried to chase this thing. It was briefly tracked on radar, but then it seemed to be able to, and this again is a phrase from the document, it's almost like it cloaked itself and became invisible. You'd think this was science fiction if you weren't reading it in Pentagon documents. And we know now, which we didn't know before, that the government took this very seriously, and these things are being seen in our skies, whatever they might be, by pilots tracked on radar, and there's a serious defense and national security issue here.
And just to be clear, we don't believe that any other country possesses the technology to create an aircraft like this, right?
Absolutely correct, yes. One of the things that went into this report was obviously looking to see if this sort of thing was anything in our own inventory and indeed anything that any other nation has. I mean, certainly when I was investigating UFOs for the British government, we knew that some of these things would turn out to be secret prototype aircraft, drones and missiles, but we always knew through our own intelligence sources, you know, who has what, so you can eliminate that.
So what you're really saying is that the U.S. government and the British government have essentially concluded that there's something not from this world that humans did not create that is being tracked on radar and watched by people who watch aircraft for a living. I mean, this is real.
It is real. Now, the government doesn't go so far as to say these things are extraterrestrial, but certainly when I was doing this for the Ministry of Defense, our policy statement said neither do we rule out that possibility. We said that we kept an open mind on this. But of course, you know, these things, when their speeds and maneuvers are in excess of anything that you've got or anything that you're aware other nations have, you are forced almost to think the unthinkable. And absolutely. Part of the problem with this, of course, was just that senior political figures and military chiefs often just said UFOs, and they rolled their eyes, and it was the ridicule factor.
This seems like
we were able to say...
I'm sorry, we're out of time, Nick. This just seems like a story that we should be covering much more than we do, and I hope you will come back. Thank you.
Thank you, I will do.
We're going to close tonight with a tribute to a longtime friend of ours, Charles Krauthammer. That's next.